Hello, I'm Helen Bradley. Welcome to this video tutorial. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how you can create flowers the easy way in Illustrator. Before we start with this video tutorial, let's look and see what it is that we're trying to do. I'm going to show you how you can create all 4 of these flower shapes in Illustrator, and each of them has a slightly different technique employed to create the final shape. So we're going to get started now with a brand new document. I have a starter document here, and you can create a starter document any size that you like. I'm starting off with a polygon, and mine's a 6-sided figure, so I've just set it to 6-sided. If yours doesn't come in as a 6-sided figure, just select the tool and click once on the artboard, and you can select how many sides your figure has. Now this has 6 sides, but I want it to have rounded corners, so with it selected I'm going to choose Effect and then Stylize, then Rounded Corners. I'll turn my preview on, and my corner rounding is way too high. I just want it to be the slightest of rounded corners. So let's just see what we've got. I'm just going to click away from the shape. I'm going to fill it with a gradient, so I'm going to choose Window and then Swatches, because this gives me access to gradients. I'm going to use a gradient that was shipped with Illustrator, so I'm going to click the flyout menu, open Swatch Library, Gradients, and I'm going for color combinations because I'm thinking this first gradient is a pretty good starter for my document. I'm just going to switch it so it's actually the fill gradient, and I don't want any stroke on my shape for now. So with the gradient selected, I'm going to choose Window and then Gradient, because I want to make a slight adjustment to the gradient. I don't want the green to be in it at all, so I'm just dragging green away from the shape. And I'll probably take out this pink as well. So I want a more gradual change across my shape. And I'd also like my gradient to be linear but in the opposite direction. So let's set it at 90 degrees. So this is going to be the outside of my petal, and this is going to be the inside. So let's just reshape the gradient a little bit before we go. I'm going to size my shape down quite small so that I can start off with creating my flower. And my flower is created using a rotation, so I'm going to choose Effect, Distort and Transform, and then Transform. I'll turn the preview on, and I'm going to start with about 100 copies just so that I can see how this is going to work. And I want my copies to get bigger as they go, so I'm going to set this to start off with to 102%. 101, 102, something like that is a good value. And I want them to spiral around, so I'm going to move them just a little bit. I'm thinking probably 1 point horizontally and vertically. And then I'm going to start increasing my angle. And as I increase my angle, different things start to happen with my shape. And I'm looking for an effect that looks a bit like the leaves on a flower. Now right now these are not behaving very well, so let's try increasing this value. So I'm moving it a little bit more each time, and you can see now that we're starting to see the effect here of leaves on a flower. So it's obvious to me that I need to increase my movement size a little bit more than I had been. I can try tweaking the angle to see if that gives me a different result. I can also select different rotation points. So if I click here, the shape is rotated around a different point on my original shape, and this is probably the one I want. But let's just see how different rotation points affect the shape that we get, and it affects how the gradient is being viewed. So I'm thinking I'm going to use this one. I'm really happy with this. So I'm just going to click OK to select those options. And now I'm going to add a stroke to it because I think a stroke will outline the petals. So I'm going to choose a darker color stroke. Now I also want to go back in and show you something. So I'm going to go to Window and then Appearance because I want to see the Appearance panel. This entire effect is created from just this one shape. And here is the Transform option that we use to transform the shape to make these flowers. If I click on this, you'll see that Scale, Strokes and Effects is disabled. If it were enabled, and I've just enabled it, you'll see that the stroke around the outer edge of the flower is a lot thicker than it is in the middle of the flower. If we don't scale strokes and effects, then we have the same stroke width all the way around the flower, and I think that's a better result. So I'm just going to click OK. And now I can just resize my shape. If I bring my shape down a little bit in size, my flower is going to get a little bit smaller. And with my shape selected, if I click on the gradient and then open up the gradient dialog by clicking here, then I can affect the gradient. So I can make the transition of the gradient on the leaves a little bit different by just dragging these gradient stops. So if my flower was not dark enough and light enough, if I didn't see that transition between dark and light, well, I can make it happen, and I can make it happen by just readjusting my gradient. Provided my original gradient looked on the flower pretty much the way I wanted it to look, but perhaps without the brightness that I wanted, then I can start affecting it here. I can also change the angle, and as I change the angle on the gradient, we're also going to change how it's applied to that initial shape, and that's going to affect how it is applied to the flower. So I can tweak my final result here in the gradient dialog. Now that I've finished that, I'm just going to click away from my original shape, and you can see that the middle of the flower isn't looking particularly flower-like. Well, we can solve that by popping a flower in the middle of the flower. Let's do that by selecting the Ellipse tool, and I'm just going to drag out a fairly large circle. I'm going to add some path points to that circle, so I'm going to choose Object, Path, Add Anchor Points, and that adds some additional anchor points to the shape. I'm also going to make this gradient radial, so let's just click on the gradient tool and let's turn this into a radial gradient. And I think I'm just going to take this stop off and adjust it a little bit and probably reverse it. So this is going to be the middle of my flower, and to make it a little bit more flower-like rather than just being a circle, if I select on it and choose Object, Path, Average, and if I select both and click OK, I get a flower shape. So let's just size this up, and you can see that what I'm getting is a sort of little flower shape, and I can use that inside my flower. So I can just drag it into position and then size it appropriately to be the middle of my flower. So there's the first of my flowers. I'm going to group all of these objects with Object Group so that I have them all together, and I can now scale them if I want to, make it a little bit smaller a flower, and then I can just move it out of the way while we get to work on another of the flowers. The second of the flowers I'm going to create using a long ellipse. So I'm just going to create a very long ellipse. I'm going to fill it with a solid color. So I'm just going to click here and choose a sort of orange color, and I'm going to give it a lighter color outline. So probably something like a very, very pale brown. And I'll give it a 2-point stroke. Now to make this look a little bit more like the petal of a flower, I'm again going to select it, but I'm going to select the direct selection tool, and I'm going to make one of these points pointed. So I'm selecting the bottommost point on the flower and just click this convert tool, and what that does is it converts it to something that is a bit more of a petal-like shape. I might just narrow this down as well. So once I've got my basic shape, we're ready to go back in and start to rotate this to create our flower. Effect, Distort and Transform, Transform. We'll want to transform this flower so that the center point for the transformation is this point on the shape. So I'm going to click here. I think that's going to be a good setting to start off with. I'm going to click Preview, and I'm going to start walking up my angle so we can see what's happening with the shape, and let's just add in 25 copies to start off with. You can see that when we set to rotate around the bottom center point of a petal and we set an angle but no move or no scale, our flower's not getting any bigger, but we're getting a sort of flower shape. Now I want that flower shape, but I would like mine to scale up just a little bit. So I'm going to scale it up 101 so it gets just a little bit bigger as we go, and I want more copies. So I'm going to try for 50 leaves. And then I'm going to start walking around my angle, because what I want to happen is exactly what's happening here, is that the transformation, the larger flower petals are being offset from the inner flower petals. So I'm getting a way more interesting effect, and I think provided I come back here and just make this brown outer edge a white and perhaps even darken up the inside of the flower, this is going to be a perfect flower shape for me. So I'm just going to click OK to say, yep, that's what I want. And because this entire flower shape is just one petal, I can come in here and I can target the fill color and the stroke color. I'm going to turn the stroke into white, and I'm going to make the fill just a little bit darker. And there you have this flower shape, and this is a really elegant shape, and it's done just using one petal and about 2 seconds worth of work in the Distort and Transform dialog. I'm just going to move this out of the way. By moving this one petal, the entire flower goes with it. Well, the next flower that we're going to create is going to use some blend modes. So let's see how to create that. For this flower, I can create any starting shape. So last time when I created, I actually used an ellipse, and I brought in the top edge of this. So I just grabbed a hold of it with the direct selection tool, moved it in a little bit, and then started moving its handles out. And I do that by holding the Alt key as I drag on its handles. So it was having a sort of little lip here, and I'm probably just going to flatten it out so it's a little bit of a narrower petal. But because these are flowers, the petals don't have to be perfect to start off with. Now with this petal selected, the key part of this flower is that it has some transparency built into it, and we're going to build on that transparency to get our effect. So let's give it a different color. Let's make it a sort of purple color to start off with. I'm going to grab the appearance panel, which you can get to by choosing window and then appearance, because I need to set up the appearance of this flower before we start. And what I want to do is to open up this fill. So here is the fill area, and I want to click on its opacity because I want to make it less than 100% opaque. So I'm thinking something like about 50% opacity is a really good start. And then I'm going to set its blend mode to multiply. And what this means that is, as each petal is added to each other petal as they overlap, then the petals where they overlap are going to get darker, and it's going to be a really interesting effect. Now my flower also had a dotted stroke around it, so that at the moment this flower has a 2-point solid stroke, but let's make it dotted. To do this, I'm going to click on the stroke, and I'm going to click on a rounded cap. I'm going to click on the dashed line. I'm going to set the dash to 0 and then the gap to something a little bit more than the weight, because that's going to give me my dots. So I'm actually going to bring my weight up to 3 points and my gap up to 4 just for now. I'm going to click away from this, and let's just zoom into the flower because we need to see something with this petal. I'm going to reselect the petal, and you can see that the dots are right over the very edge of this petal. Well, I want to bring them in, so with the stroke selected in the appearance panel, I'm going to choose Effect and then Path and then Offset Path, because that allows me to separately control the line around which the stroke is being applied. So I'm going to turn Preview on, and I'm going to start to decrease this value. At first the stroke totally disappears because at the moment it's being offset 5 points from the outer edge, so we're not going to be able to see it because it's white on white. But as I decrease this value, you can see that the dots start coming inside the shape, and that's exactly the effect that I want. I'm going to click OK, and I think right now my dots need to be a little bit smaller. So now that I've got the basic petal shape, let's just put the appearance panel out of the way and let's press Ctrl-0 to go back to seeing our flower petal. And now I'm going to choose Effect, Distort and Transform, but I've just noticed that right now I'm still selected my stroke in the appearance panel, and that means that any changes I make to this are going to affect this stroke only. So I'm going to make sure I click Path first of all, so that the transformation is going to affect not only the stroke but also the fill. So now Effect, Distort and Transform, and then Transform. I'm going to preview the effect so I can see what's happening, and I need to select one of these bottom edges of the petal. If this is the top of the petal, this is going to be the bottom as being the rotation point, so I'm selecting one of those. Let's type in something like 50 copies, and then let's start winding up the angle so we can see how this effect is being created. Now you can just begin to see what's happening here. The middle of this shape is darker than the outside, and the reason for this is this multiply blend mode. So let's just wind the angle up a little bit higher, and then let's start moving these petals out, and I'm going to do that by just scaling them a little bit bigger, not by actually moving them. So I'm just going to scale it to 101 in both directions and see how that goes. Well, I think that's probably not quite enough. Let's do 102. And here is our flower effect beginning to be created. Now we probably need a few more copies just to get the results that we want. Well, now that I look at it, I'm actually thinking that 101 was probably a better choice. So let's just go back to 101. I can size it up in a minute if it's not big enough. I'm going to settle for this, and I'm going to settle for around about my 66 copies. So I'll just click OK. And now with the original flower shape selected, let's go back to the fill and let's change down the opacity, because I think the opacity was too high. And when I decrease the opacity, we can see the effect of this build up with the multiply blend mode. Let's just resize the leaves to make them a little bit bigger. And there's our flower shape, depending on what it is that we start off as the initial shape and exactly how much opacity we have. This multiply blend mode is affecting how these leaves interact with each other. Now with this selected, I can go back into the transform. So this is the transform here that is affecting the whole of the path. So let's just click on that. And if the angle is not right, then I can just go and start adjusting that, making sure that I have preview turned on. So I can start adjusting the angle and decide what sort of flower I want. You can see where I'm at 30 degrees rotation. That's a nice even rotation. The flower shape is very, very different to what it looks like at 31 degrees. And at 32 degrees, it's different again. And so you may want to experiment here with just very, very small increments in the angle, because every single change to the angle is really impacting exactly how this flower looks. Now I've got a very regular shape here, so I'm just going to select that because that's a little bit of a different look to the one I showed you when we were beginning, but I really like that, so let's tuck that away. Now our final flower shape involves a simple rotation, but because I want the leaves to overlap each other in an interesting way, we're actually going to have to break it apart once we've created it and then cut off the pieces that we don't want. So let's see how we'll do that. The inspiration for this last flower shape is something like a frangipani. So I'm going to create a oval shape, and I want to fill my oval for now just with any color, and I don't want it to have a stroke. Now not having a stroke is fairly important, because if you put a stroke on this, it's just going to make life a little bit more complicated than it really needs to be. I'm going to target the bottommost point here. I'm going to convert it to a sharp point and then bring it in a little bit, so it's a little bit pointed, but not totally. So here's my basic shape. I'm now going to rotate it, so I'm going to choose Effect, Distort and Transform, and then Transform. And we're going to rotate it around this bottom middle point. I'm going to click on Preview, and I want a 5-petal flower, which means I want 4 copies of my original petal. And if you don't want to have to do the math here, you can just type in 360 divided by 5, and Illustrator will calculate how many degrees you need to rotate to evenly space 5 petals around this shape, and here they are. Now this is my basic shape, and that's all I want at this point, so I'm just going to click OK. And now I want to break it apart, so let's choose Object, Expand Appearance, and that breaks it into its component pieces. And then let's choose Object Ungroup, because that ungroups each of these petals, so each petal can be individually selected. And I'm just going to color every one of these petals a different color for a minute, because it's going to be really apparent to you when I do that as to what the issue is. And the issue here is that this green petal is in front of the red, but it's also in front of the blue. And if this were a flower, this green petal would be behind the blue petal. So what we need to do now is to fix this problem. And I'm going to use a copy of the blue petal to do that. So with the blue petal selected, I'm going to choose Edit Copy, and then Edit Paste in Place. So I have 2 blues and 1 green. And you can see I just can't simply do this, because now the blue petal is causing me problems. But what I can do is use this top blue petal to cut away the piece that I don't want in the green petal. So with the blue and the green petals both selected, I'm going to open the Pathfinder palette, Window, Pathfinder. And I know that the blue petal is on the top because I just created it. It's brand new. It's got to be above the green petal. So I'm just going to click minus front, and that's going to subtract the front shape from the back shape. It's going to subtract the blue shape from the green. And there we have it. So this is my flower. The problem is, of course, that my flower is all sorts of colors, and I want it to be a single color. Well, let's just target the fill on the flower, and let's give it a very, very pale yellow fill, and then let's go and give it a stroke. Now this is the point at which we would give it a stroke, because earlier the stroke would have just caused us a lot of distress. So let's just target this shape. I'm going to target my stroke, and I want to make my stroke a bit bigger. So let's go to Window and Stroke, and from the stroke panel let's just increase the stroke. And then when I click away from the flower, you can see that we've got 5 overlapping petals. We couldn't do that if we hadn't broken the flower apart and then rebuilt it. Now for a flower like this, I would just finish off with a very, very small circle in the middle. I'm going to fill my circle with orange. I'm going to have no stroke on it at all, and having created it, I'm just going to drag it into the center of this flower. So there you have 4 flower shapes, all created in Illustrator, all created using the Rotate and Transform tool, but all with very, very different results. I'm Helen Bradley. Thank you for joining me for this video tutorial. Look out for more video tutorials here on my YouTube channel, and consider subscribing to my channel, and you'll be alerted when new videos are released. And visit my website at projectwoman.com, where you'll find more tips, tricks and tutorials on a range of applications, including Photoshop, Lightroom, Illustrator and a whole lot more.